All right, let's get started. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Colby Duran. I'm the director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas, and we're the research partner of the Native Farm Bill Coalition. Thank you all very much for joining us for this afternoon's webinar on considerations for industrial hemp production in Indian country. This is another installment in our webinar series where we're taking a look at several of the different provisions from of the tribal-specific provisions that came out of the 2018 Farm Bill. We're going to go into a good amount of detail today on hemp. Just a brief overview of the agenda. We'll be covering sort of why is there this hemp hype, looking at the existing laws on hemp production, with then a specific focus on the 2018 Farm Bill hemp provisions. Do an update on the Farm Bill implementation of these provisions at USDA, and then talk briefly about some of the production considerations as well. Just to get started, and wanted to give you all an introduction, for we have a lot of new folks on as well too, just to meet our team at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. Again, my name is Colby Duran. I'm the new director, and I'm very honored to have been able to take over from our founding director, Janie Sims-Hip, in that role. We also have our research director and staff attorney, Aaron Parker, and I'm joined today on our webinar by our policy officer and staff attorney, Blake Jackson. And we also have Whitney Swanee, who's our communications manager as well. We were founded at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative in 2013 in the University of Arkansas School of Law. We were founded by, at the time, Dean, but now Vice Chancellor Stacy Leeds, and of course, our founding director, Janie Sims-Hip. And when Dean Leeds became Vice Chancellor Leeds and moved to the Office of Economic Development last July, we actually moved up with her. And that's what really fit within our mission at IFAI that we were established with, in the foundation that both Stacy and Janie established us with, is to enhance health and wellness in tribal communities by advancing healthy food systems, supporting diversified economic development, and cultural food traditions throughout Indian country. And what we kind of really look at ourselves as is kind of saying the work that we do is really helping putting the tribal sovereignty and food sovereignty. And we do that, and our work really centers around providing strategic legal analysis, policy analysis, and educational resources to empower Indian country through food sovereignty, agriculture, and of course, economic development. While we are the research partner in the Native Farm Bill Coalition, we do a lot of other things as well too. We also are the Native American Tribal Center for Food Safety Outreach and Education and Training Assistance, and that's in compliance with the produce safety rule. We're also developing an alternative curriculum-based training that's specifically targeting native produce growers. We have a model tribal food and agriculture code, which is a free resource for tribal governments that are looking to either further develop or to incorporate food and agriculture laws as part of their codes. We do food policy roundtable discussions across Indian country. We also do and work in support with the National Association of Food Distribution Programs on Indian Reservations, or NAFDIPR, which just held their annual conference this week out at Choctaw, Mississippi. We have a Native Youth and Food and Agriculture Leadership Summit, which is entering its 6th year, which will be at the end of July. And we also have a project where we help Native food businesses scale up and take that next step in their food production. And then, of course, we are the research partner in the Native Farm Bill Coalition. And for folks that are familiar with the Native Farm Bill Coalition and the work, it was established in October 2017. Currently, there's over 170 tribes represented in the coalition. That includes 77 Native nations that have passed resolutions or letters of support. There's also 15 intertribal or Native organizations that have joined as well. And we, of course, have several allied organizations, including our friends at Mazone, a Jewish Response to Hunger, and the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And so in today's webinar, we'll be focusing on some of the hemp provisions as well. We know this is an incredibly hot topic that we get a lot of questions about. So if there's any questions that you have along the way and you wanted to be able to ask those, please don't hesitate to do so. You can participate in the webinar. You can do so by typing a question into the question panel, and we'll be happy to read it aloud and answer it. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question aloud. And if you do so, I can unmute your microphone and you can ask your question and then we can answer it from there. Or if you have additional input or things you're hearing you'd like to raise, please feel free to do so as well. And so If you haven't joined yet and you're interested in joining the Native Farm Bill Coalition, if your tribe or tribal organization has not, please consider doing so. We're really at this kind of very critical phase, I think, of the Farm Bill work. We're really the legislative effort, and the 63 tribal provisions that got in was an incredibly strong effort, and shows just how impactful having so many tribal leaders and tribal organizations engaged, speaking with one strong voice, and the impact that can have on legislation. But that is almost 49% of the effort, and the 51% of it is ensuring that those incredible provisions that were fought for by tribal leadership and by tribal organizations are implemented by USDA with the intent and the impact that they were meant to have. So while USDA is trying to implement the Farm Bill, voices from tribal leaders and tribal representatives need to continue to be at the table to ensure that those provisions are maintained. And just so, building off of that, there is another opportunity and another tribal consultation and listening session that's coming up at the end of this month. This is the second full one that USDA is doing. It'll be at NCAI's mid-year conference. It starts with a listening session on the evening of Wednesday, June 26th, and will continue the following day in the afternoon to be a consultation from 1 to 5 p.m. There's still time to register. There's about another week for folks to register for that. You can do so by emailing the tribal relations email on the screen. And when you do that, please include the information regarding the name, the tribal organization you're representing, and some of the other pertinent information, some of the issues that you're interested in discussing at that as well, if you'd like to be added to the Office of Tribal Relations newsletter as well. So there's a lot of opportunities to be able to provide more engagement with USDA. And prior to that, there will be a USDA tribal consultation listening session prep session, an implementation session for tribal leaders and tribal representatives, and that's Wednesday afternoon at NCAI as part of the Farm Bill breakout session that's occurring there, to talk a little bit about some of the issues that have come up and also address some of the topics that will be covered. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to our resident hemp expert, Blake Jackson, to talk about the hemp hype and the hemp provisions in the 2018 Farm Bill.
Thank you, Colby. It's my pleasure to be with you guys today and talk about some of the developments that we've had with the legalization of industrial hemp in the 2018 Farm Bill. Kind of going off of some of the developments we've had, hemp has been one of the more popular topics that we've dealt with, and we've been getting a lot of questions on this area because it presents a really big economic development opportunity for Indian country in accessing a market that's been largely inaccessible in the past because of the restrictions around it. So I'm going to detail some of those and then kind of go into some of the bigger pieces of that as part of this discussion. Am I in? One second here. Am I in control of the screen? Or? Just let me do it on yours. PowerPoint. Is it? I can't see it on. Okay. So one of the first things I want to talk about here is just the background on hemp production in Indian country. So hemp is a derivative of the cannabis sativa plant. It comes from the same kind of overarching plant class that you see marijuana come from, but there's some different chemical compositions here. Mainly, the big one is the THC and the CBD content. With marijuana, you see a higher concentration of THC and a lower concentration of CBD. But with hemp, it's that relationship is kind of inverted to where you see a higher concentration of CBD, which has a lot of the properties that hemp is grown for, and a low content of the THC, which is the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana that's led to its being illegal in a lot of places, but we're seeing kind of a reversal in that general trend right now. But that's kind of where where the confusion kind of came from between these two plants. So it's kind of good to have that differentiation, and the difference is largely chemical. The crop is a very versatile crop in that it can be grown in for a multitude of different purposes. You can grow it for fiber or seed, or you can grow it for a dual purpose crop of both, given the way that the crop has been utilized worldwide. Currently, there are over 25,000 estimated products for hemp, and that kind of spans over 9 submarkets, which I'll detail a little bit more in the further coming slides. But just largely, these are industrial. You see these hemp as being used for parts of vehicles. We have fiber that's being used for textiles, seeds that are used for food products that are used for fiber. You have the oil, you have hemp oil, but you also have CBD oil. That's another product of this. Again, food. And you also have fuel. Historically, one of Henry Ford's cars was used hemp oil as a biofuel, which is kind of an interesting fact to know that there's been some historical developments in this area. In 2017, there's the information on this is pretty scattered, to be quite honest, guys, because this has not been much of a legal market, because this has been outlawed until recently. But from what data we can gather, the Hemp Business Journal is probably the leading source on this, and they've estimated that hemp retail products have sold at 820 million in 2017. That's what latest data that we have. But a lot of these products are imported because they're not legal domestically, unless they're being done maybe in a state that, at such a small scale that they're not being federally enforced upon. But we need to know that this is a market share that we can enter into now, and there is a large opportunity to make domestic products, because our closest neighbor to the north, Canada, has been accounting for as much of 90% of the imported products that we have here in today's market. So building from that, as you can see here, there's the 9 different markets that you can kind of classify with, and this chart does a good job of breaking down the different ways that you can use hemp, and it's just a very versatile crop is kind of the thing to take away here. But you have the different textile pieces from the fibers, the herds and the shives have different uses. Leaves, from the seeds, you can get both hemp oil and seed cake, which have their own properties. From the plant, you have different uses as well. So just a very versatile crop here. I'm not going to go through all of this because it's a pretty exhaustive analysis, but these slides will be provided at a later date, so you'll have access to this information if you would like to review it a little bit more thoroughly at its own time. So anyway, just wanted to demonstrate that. But with the next piece of this, as I said earlier, hemp market domestically is estimated to be at $820 million. And that was only in 2017. But some research done by the Farm Bureau indicates that this is only projected to continue to increase as we continue to go. And as you can see here, the different sales category breakouts, it's pretty proportional unless you just look at the other products or the supplements having the smallest market. But there's a large market for CBD and personal care products as you continue to go through all of this. And we continue to see an increasing interests in industrial applications because they're more sustainable and they're more earth-derived products, and they're less synthetic than some of the current products that we use in some construction and also even in renewable energy. So that's something to keep in mind as we kind of have more of an environmentally conscious consumer market. We see an uptick in popularity in these products, and we see an alternate market developing for economic development. So it's a pretty good opportunity for Indian country going forward. To kind of put a little bit more perspective into this, every few years, the USDA Economic Research Service does research on the share of the food dollar. And this information is put out, it's on USDA's website, but it does a really good job of demonstrating the value added importance of agriculture. And something that our friends over at Intertribal Agriculture Council have pointed out with this is that, we're always looking for diversified economic development opportunities in Indian country. But if we grow hemp as just a farm production, as a commodity crop, that's not where the money really is here. It's in kind of vertically integrating and putting some more operations in there to capture a better share of that food dollar. If we were to just do processing, packing, and transportation alone, we could triple the tribal share of the dollar in this sector. So even though that's general agricultural research, that is especially true in the hemp facility, because the research has indicated that a lot of the money is made in that value added opportunity through the processing, transportation, and packaging of these products domestically. Initially, before we kind of address where we're at with hemp production, it's very important to to kind of have an understanding of where we've been and how we got here. Hemp originally was outlawed as a Schedule One substance under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, and largely this is because it's included in the very expansive definition of marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act. And we see that because there's a culture of the war on drugs. You also had there's some other theories behind this, that there were some private interests that wanted to capture the market share that hemp was using for developing products, and so they lobbied for it to become part of the marijuana definition. But whatever the case, it is until recently was included within that statutory definition of marijuana and was treated as a Class 1 substance. And because of that, it was outlawed as a commodity crop. But in 2014, we saw a partial lift of this ban because we saw the hemp pilot program in the 2014 Farm Bill, which allowed a grower to partner with a state Department of Agriculture or a higher educational institution to grow hemp for strictly research purposes. And it had to be done as one of these pilot programs. But the kicker to that was to partner with either one of those entities. Hemp production had to be allowed under the state law where either the Department of Agriculture or the higher institution of learning was located. So we see kind of a partial lift toward that ban, but we don't really see the door crack really wide open on this until here recently in the 2018 provisions. So with that authority, we saw an expansive list of states that took some sort of action to legalize the industrial hemp production for specifically just for research purposes under these pilot programs. Latest research from the National Conference of State Legislatures details that there have been 41 states that have enacted some sort of legislation allowing hemp production in their states. So, I mean, that's a pretty big chunk of the country. But the thing to note here is that, I talked about state law, state departments of agriculture. We see a very big favoring towards states in the way this was implemented. And we look at the 2014 Farm Bill, and there's been some question about tribal participation under the 2014 authorities. And that's been largely limited because there is a lack of tribal parity in that language because it relies specifically on states. So there's not an explicitly an avenue for tribal colleges and universities or tribal departments of agriculture, if a tribe has one of those in their governmental body, to participate in this program, because there is no language affording tribal law. You have to go through a state Department of Agriculture or a state higher institution of learning, a higher institution of learning in a state where it's legal under state law to do this. So we see kind of a barrier to access into this market until recently. In the 2018 Farm Bill, we see the legalization of industrial hemp production. And what the thing here is that the plant has to have a THC content, that psychoactive property that we talked about in marijuana. You can have THC in your hemp crop, but it has to be at 0.3% or less on a dry weight basis. That's the definition that they've included in this section of the Farm Bill. We see the allowance of state and tribal governments to self-regulate their own hemp production within their respective jurisdictions with a USDA approved plan that outlays some of the elements further detailed in this discussion. We see an authorization of technical assistance to tribes in developing these plans and submitting those to USDA. It requires that states and tribes permit the transportation of hemp through its jurisdiction if the hemp is lawfully produced under an approved state or tribal plan. And it includes hemp as a commodity eligible for federal crop insurance when the requisite statutory criteria are satisfied. So if a tribe wants to get into this and and wants to take advantage of this and exercise their sovereignty under this delegated jurisdiction that USDA is offered, there are a few elements that have to be met. There's 7 different ones here, but as you can see, they largely center upon record keeping of the way you always know where the hemp is being produced, and you have to keep these records and show USDA how you're doing that for a period of 3 years. Obviously, to become compliant with the plan that admitting that you want to say, yes, we want to regulate this, you're going to have to do something to maintain compliance with that. So making sure that the THC levels are below that 0.3% statutory requirement is a key here. And also, if the plant does test hot above that 0.3%, then it's legally marijuana. So you have to have a process of disposing of plants that don't fit the statutory definition. The policy for how the tribe will enforce compliance with the statute, how you're going to go about that with your inspection authority, how you're going to conduct annual inspections and random sampling of producers, because that's another requirement of these are all in the Farm Bill, by the way. These are statutory requirements. There's certain information that when you are given that by the tribe, that when the tribe is given some statutory required producer information, that the USDA has to get that within 30 days. But the key here of all of these is that the tribe has to attest that it has and will devote sufficient resources and personnel to ensure that there is compliance with this plan, because the USDA, and Congress both really want to ensure that this plan is being followed to a T, and that the resources necessary throughout Indian country are being devoted to its compliance. So when you submit a proposed plan to USDA, the Secretary of Agriculture then consults with the Attorney General just to kind of keep them in the loop. But then they have to do that. There's that affirmative requirement to consult with the Attorney General so that they are aware of what's going on. And then they have to issue an approval or denial to the individual tribe or state within 60 days. And if no tribe or state submits a plan, then the USDA has a plan that they are in the process of drafting that will serve as the regulatory vehicle for that particular jurisdiction. But I will say here, with the consultation with the Attorney General, the Farm Bill does specify that that should not impact the decision to approve or deny. A heads up with everything going on in this discussion, so that they are aware of things, or maybe there might be some question as to the legal requirements, because this was kind of a highly regulated area. That was that's a legislative provision in there, but that shouldn't impact the yes or no that you would get from USDA. As I said, there are interstate commerce protections here, explicitly prohibiting tribes or state governments from interfering with the interstate shipping and transportation of legally produced hemp. That's under section 10114 of the Farm Bill. But the kicker is that the hemp must have been legally produced at its point of origin. So if you're going through a state that, for instance, makes it illegal to produce hemp, that state cannot do anything to you under federal law if you're transporting or shipping it to another state where that it's been duly ordered or in the process of transacting business, so long as the place that you are transporting it from had legally produced it under the federal laws that were either there under 2014 Farm Bill Authority or 2018 Farm Bill Authority. And we also see some conforming changes to the Controlled Substances Act. Hemp is now removed from the statutory definition of marijuana. And the way you see it spelled there is the statutory spelling of it, even though we usually see it with a J. That's the legal language Congress used when they enacted the Controlled Substances Act in 1970. It's no longer a Schedule I substance, but the thing is, if you don't produce it in according with the tribal or state or USDA plan or under the 2014 pilot program authorities, it falls outside of that definition and is still considered marijuana under the federal law. Some additional items to discuss in this arena. There is no regulatory framework for these new provisions yet. So one of the requirements of the Farm Bill was that USDA enact regulations, and the words were expeditiously, to implement this new title. And part of that is that we don't have those regulations implementing this law. So at the time being, existing hemp products are not legal under federal law because they couldn't have been produced under the provisions, because we don't have a full implementation of those yet. So right now, the only vehicle we see for the legal production of industrial hemp under federal law is going through a state pilot program. Specifically, the Farm Bill reserves the authority of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to enforce its authority under the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act. Then the FDA released a statement just merely moments after the Farm Bill was signed, stating that its commissioner, Gottlieb, who was the commissioner at the time, views these products that they have CBD or THC added to them to be illegal under federal law as an adulterated food or drug product. The other thing we see in the USDA must affirmatively approve or deny all submitted tribal and state hemp production plans. It's not like other areas of federal Indian law where we see maybe a deemed approve authority if you don't get a response from the secretary or the appropriate branch of that agency within so many days, because there is that affirmative requirement for them to give you a yes or a no, and you can't have that deemed approved because they would not be able to consult with the attorney general without that. So that's a statutory requirement that they have to have that affirmative conversation with the attorney general, and that there has to be a formal yes or no given to you. And individuals with a state or federal controlled substance felony conviction are ineligible to participate in industrial hemp production for a period of 10 years following their conviction. There's a little bit of a grandfathering provision if you had already been producing under the 2014 Farm Bill, that in an opinion recently released by the Office of General Counsel at USDA. But that's just kind of a small quirk there. But by and large, these convictions are a bar to being a producer or being licensed under this new statutory scheme. We do have a few updates, regulatory and implementation updates from the USDA. We've been discussing this topic quite frequently, and USDA has also said in several listening sessions, the Agricultural Marketing Service is the agency that has the lead regulatory authority over this under the Farm Bill. And on their website and in a listening session yesterday, they confirmed that they are still on track to release these regulations in fall of 2019. So later this fall, probably toward the end of the year, around November is the date that everyone's been kind of thinking, October, November, that these regulations will be released and finalized in time to accommodate the 2020 growing season. So they're still on track to meet that secretarial directive. And until then, tribal and state regulatory plans that are being submitted to them are being put on hold, essentially. You have that 60-day requirement that they have to give you that the yes or the no, but the way that they're interpreting the statute is that the 60 days does not begin to run until they have regulations in place. So if you send a plan right now, it's merely going to be put in the waiting pile. And until then, you have to rely on that 2014 Farm Bill authority to continue growing. There's been a couple of notices to trade that have been released by the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. The importation of hemp seeds was an area of large concern throughout tribal consultation and conversations with both the Office of Tribal Relations and Agricultural Marketing Service, because if we haven't had a legal market here, how are we going to get the seeds to grow the crop? And so with the new definition of hemp under the 2018 Farm Bill, everything is included in that. The leaves, the seeds are all included within the statutory definition of hemp, which puts all of this within USDA's purview and jurisdiction. And as a result of that, and it no longer being a Controlled Substances Act definition of marijuana, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, no longer has the authority to require hemp seed permits for import purposes. That jurisdiction is now exercised by the USDA, and they are merely looking at this for plant and pest control problems. The only thing they require is that you have a phytosanitary certificate from the exporting country. That country is a National Plant Protection Organization to verify the origin of the seed and that there are no plant pests detected that are going to pose an issue to the crop once it's imported here. So that's kind of a development there, is that we see less barriers to importing hemp seed, but these regulations and this requirement will be looked at by Customs and Border Patrol when it does come through. So just know that will be monitored by them, but that is a new requirement. And we have been told in listening sessions that this has been going smoothly on behalf of USDA's enforcement. Another notice to trade that we see is the USDA clarifying hemp production for Indian tribes. So as stated earlier, To participate in a hemp pilot program under that 2014 authority, a tribe must go through a state Department of Agriculture or an institution of higher education. And hemp production must be legal under the law of the state in which the tribe is located. So if you're looking to do that with a state Department of Agriculture or an institution of higher education in your state, post-secondary, then it has to be legal under state law for you to partner with one of those eligible entities. But under this notice to trade, we also see the fact that you can partner with a college, university, one of those institutions of higher learning, or with a state Department of Agriculture in another state. But the stipulation here is that hemp production has to be legal under state law, under both both the state where the tribe is located and where that partnering entity is located. So you have to be compliant with the laws of both states when you're doing this. And this notice to trade was very clear in that the law remains unchanged for tribes. So we're still seeing that you have to go through that vehicle of state jurisdiction to participate in that 2014 authority, because that is the statutory language and the way that USDA has interpreted that in the Office of General Counsel. The other piece that we see is there's a notice to trade. There's a legal opinion on the authorities for hemp production. The 2014 authority that I've been discussing with the hemp research pilot program, that authority is set to lapse 1 year from the date that USDA releases its plan to regulate hemp production. And so, we talked about if the tribe or the state doesn't propose its own plan, that USDA is going to draft a model plan and exercise jurisdiction in the areas where a state or tribe doesn't assert that jurisdiction. Well, once the USDA releases that plan, 1 year from that date, the 2014 authority for the research pilot program will lapse under this notice to trade that was issued. Also, the interstate commerce protections that we've been discussing, those have different trigger dates. So right now, if you're producing hemp under the 2014 Farm Bill authorities, you have the full protections of interstate commerce. If you're trying to produce under the 2018 Farm Bill authorities, that's not going to kick in until those regulations are finalized. And that makes sense when one considers that hemp has to be legally produced at its point of origin. And you can't legally produce it under the 2018 authorities until we get those regulations on the books. So that's something to keep in mind, and it logically follows when we thought more about that when that finally came out. So just kind of know that those 2 trigger dates are different for those protections. And lastly, we've been getting a lot of questions on crop insurance for this, because to manage that risk in the agricultural sector, we need to have some risk management strategies in place. And one of those, as part of that farm safety net, is crop insurance. And the speculation has largely been by research groups here on campus, by Farm Bureau, that it would be part of a whole farm revenue policy. And we saw some clarity in that earlier this month. The president signed the Disaster Relief Act, Disaster Relief Bill, the additional appropriation for all the national disasters that have been happening with regard to weather and flooding, on June 6th. And as part of there was a rider that stated that beginning in the 2020 reinsurance year, hemp will be covered under a whole farm revenue policy for federal crop insurance. So that will be something that we see in the coming year. In this past year, we didn't see a legalization of that because at the time that the insurance coverage had started, hemp was still listed under that marijuana provision as being a class 1 substance, and you couldn't grow hemp and insure it because it was still an illegal drug. Although we saw a change to that later in 2018, the policies were already in place the way they were written, and so we couldn't really retroactively change that according to the USDA interpretation under the Risk Management Agency. But we see some relief of that coming in the next year. And with that, there are obviously some additional concerns that one must look at large when looking to produce hemp. Seed acquisition and certification, making sure that you have seeds from a trusted source and that they are certified to have that quality control. Equipment availability, because right now there isn't a lot of equipment that is commercially available to harvest without any retrofitting done by a producer. The THC content testing methodologies, because there needs to be a way to verify that it's below that 0.3% on a dry weight basis. And so the methods by which a state or tribe is going to assert its THC testing methodology could matter in that regard if there's any variance to those methods. We will see maybe some recommended methodologies in the regulations when those come out, but right now we're just kind of waiting to see what the USDA is going to come up with. The technical assistance for tribal plan development, we haven't heard a lot on this issue, but the statute does authorize that. So seeing what that's going to look like down the road. Buffers between other crops and concurrent operations, especially where marijuana is legal under state law or even tribal law, to make sure that there's kind of an appropriate distance between those to prevent any kind of cross pollination or anything like that. Currently, like I said, there is no crop insurance. So if you are growing right now, there is a lack of a safety net in the current coverage year. So making sure that that is implemented in a way that is in accordance with the legislative intent to make sure that we do have that safety net in play for growing down the road. And from there, that's we've released a white paper on this issue, kind of going through all these issues in a little more depth. We are going to re-release this white paper in the next week or so with the updates, the recent notices to trade updates, some additional statistics and figures, and some information that's kind of come to light since we released it in March of 2019. And we will provide that at a later date, but just keep an eye out for that. If you already have a copy of this, great, but just know that more information is on the way. And we're doing this as a re-release and putting it in the current publication. That way, if you're wanting to gather the most recent information, you're not having to look through an update or look through multiple sources. You could just have it in one comprehensive document going forward. So hopefully that's a little more convenient for everyone on the other end in doing research on this topic. And then lastly, I think we're at the point where we can take some questions or discussion if we haven't had any along the way.
Great. Thank you very much, Blake, for that. And so, folks, if you want to be able to participate and ask some questions or have comments or other things that have come up during Blake's really great and detailed explanation, you can type your questions into the question box, and we'll read those aloud and answer those. You can also raise your hand, and we can unmute your microphone if you'd like to ask your question aloud. And with all of that detailed information, we've actually gotten several questions already. The first one is asking information about where can you find out the figure on the background on U.S. Hemp production. I guess some of the figures, and that would be where that number came from.
That number is one that I got from the Farm Bureau's website, and that was pulled from the Hemp Business Journal. There's a very detailed section on there about kind of some of the background and the research they've done on hemp policy, and those graphs that's their information. That's why I was trying to kind of attribute that information to where it came from. But it's kind of, I've acquired it from Farm Bureau by way of the Hemp Business Journal. So any background on that would be in the publication that they've released on that matter.
And I believe that's also where we also have that infographic on the hemp markets as well. That was pulled from that same information as well too. The next question we have is this just for federal tribes, or can it be a state tribe as well? I think looking at the federal authorities for this and how it was broken down within the 2018 Farm Bill, it creates those three tracks, and so it would be for federally recognized tribes to create that jurisdiction to be able to do it. Now that means a state recognized tribe would also be able to enter into it, but would have to do so under a different authority, probably working directly with the state that they're in regarding it, or underneath the state laws as part of it, but probably couldn't happen separately if that state didn't allow it as well, because a lot of it would be contingent upon the jurisdiction of the land. The next question we have is asking about, are tribes authorized to participate in the crop insurance program?
As of now, for hemp, there is no crop insurance for this, but as an individual grower, you would be eligible in any way that you're currently eligible for crop insurance in the 2020 crop insurance year for this crop. So at the current time for hemp, the answer is no, but if you're eligible in other ways, as you would be for other commodity crops, hemp would be included in that, but you would have to be covered under a whole farm revenue policy instead of any of the other policies that are out there available. And those are all detailed in more ways through Risk Management Agency, is the agency that is charged with managing federal crop insurance, but you would have to go through a whole farm revenue policy that would include all of your revenue, not only from hemp, but any kind of other operations that you have. And if you had a lower amount of revenue for that year than you had in the past, then you would have some sort of indemnity in that. But at the current time, no, there's not eligibility for crop insurance for hemp specific to tribes.
Thanks for that. A good question and good answer. How about any specific data or information on the water usage that hemp has, either per acre? I know sometimes they have per plant. I know the information is there for marijuana plants, and it might be similar. But is there anything you've heard in particular, Blake?
With regard to the production of this, with being a water heavy crop, I have seen some of the research that you're referring to on marijuana, and that it is a water intensive crop. I am not aware of irrigation research done on hemp. And it's important to keep in mind that, we're kind of, a lot of research hasn't been available for the fact that we haven't had a lot of growth in this space, quite literally, because it's been outlawed for the last few, since we've considered it literally a drug, when it wasn't necessarily one for a long time. So a lot of the research that we're seeing in this area comes from Canada, because that they are the leading importer, we import the most of their products. Struggling with the wording here, but yeah, so that's where most of the research has come from. But I would imagine that the research would be similar, given that they're both, basically cousins that are from the same cannabis plant, and that if one variant of cannabis is very water intensive, you might see some slight variations, but I would assume that it would also be a water intensive crop, just based off of the research that we have out there that might be kind of maybe a little tangential, but somewhat related to this.
Thank you. The next question we have is talking about the 2014 Farm Bill provision and being able to participate in that. Can you just talk a little bit about that process and what it would look like if a tribe wanted to participate under the 2014 authority?
Sure. So the way it works now is that so if you're, depending on your state, you would have to have, the state would have to, first of all, your state legislature would have had to have passed a law saying that the production of industrial hemp, or for research purposes, depending on how they've worded the statute, that basically you have to have a state law that says we allow the production of industrial hemp for research purposes in our state. That's the first thing that has to be there. The second thing that has to be there is you have to either find some sort of hook, and that hook can come in one of two ways. You can find a institution of higher education in your state that's willing to engage in growing hemp for industrial or for research purposes. This could be a community college. This could be a land grant. This can be a 1994 tribal colleges or universities. It could be any higher education institution under federal law, and you can partner with one of them, or you can partner with the State Department of Agriculture, depending upon the relationship there and everything, depending on kind of how the atmosphere is in your state. But those are one of the two eligible partners you would have to contact, and it would be very specific to the parties involved. But as long as that authority is there under state law for you to do it, and you have an eligible partner in one of those two classifications that's willing to partner with you on that, then you can legally grow under there for research purposes. So that's the avenue you would have to go, but it largely is dependent upon the state that you're in, and it's largely dependent upon the kind of production that they're wanting to enter into, and what kind of authority they've had to grow, and what kind of authority that the state legislature has allowed them to grow. So there's a lot of case-by-case specifics in this, but by and large, that would be the common theme. The thing to note here is that it's largely left to state jurisdiction, because The only thing that's really played into this is USDA NIFA has kind of been in this from a funding standpoint because it's kind of an extension piece, but we don't really see a central regulatory agency, so it's largely a creature of state law. The only role that USDA has really played is saying, yes, you can do this as long as the state authorizes it, and the state is the one that's kind of in the driver's seat there. So just following up with those resources and making sure that you have entities willing to enter into and leverage those partnerships so that it's a good venture for both parties involved.
While this is an area of large interest for tribes and is one of the top questions we get regarding Farm Bill implementation, we're hopeful that this information, be able to help tribal leaders, tribal producers, folks throughout Indian country that are interested in production to be able to have a starting point and to get some answers and questions regarding the authority and places where it's going, and also help answer some implementation questions. And we will be putting out more information regarding hemp, and also the latest hemp developments as that becomes available, and updating our white paper as well and having that sent out next week. This is something that probably has a new development almost every couple of weeks or so, as the USDA is moving closer and closer and closer to that fall 2019 deadline that they've set to be able to get their regulations in place for the 2020 growing cycle. So we know there are a lot of questions, and sometimes questions that sort of lead to more questions, but we're trying to put out as much additional information as possible. So, are there any additional questions or comments, other things that folks really have that they want to talk about? Again, if you are going to be attending NCI's mid-year, or you'll be in the area in Reno, Nevada, there will be another USDA consultation on the 26th and 27th of those days, where you'll have an opportunity to be able to, as tribal leaders and tribal representatives, be able to sit down in consultation and a listening session with USDA to discuss some of these issues in depth, as well as the other issues of implementation of the 63 tribal provisions in the Farm Bill. So there'll be a lot of other opportunities to have those discussions. And as we're getting kind of close to the top of the hour here, and on a pretty nice Friday afternoon from hopefully a lot of folks here as well, just one last call for questions. And again, you can type them in or raise your hand. I know we got several in there as well too. We covered a lot of information. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online, and that will, when that gets sent out to not only the participants of this webinar, but also to the folks on the Native Farm Bill Coalition listserv and the Indigenous Food and Agriculture listserv, you'll have that information made available to you as well. So I think that's something to be able to keep an eye out for. But I think with that, let's put the contact information for our hemp expert, Blake, and myself at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions you have regarding the stuff from this webinar, the 2018 Farm Bill implementation. In our role as the research partner in the Native Farm Bill Coalition, we try to be able to put out and provide as much information as possible for the tribes in the coalition, our all the other members who are help leading this effort, which includes the Shakopee, Metawakan, and Sioux community, the Intertribal Agriculture Council, and the National Congress of American Indians. So if there's anything that we can do to be helpful in some of the things that you're hearing or seeing out there, please don't hesitate to reach out. And again, if your tribe or your tribal organization has not joined the Native Farm Bill Coalition, please consider doing so, and just reach out to us to be able to get the information on how to join. But with that, thank you all very much for joining us on this Friday to have a hemp discussion. We really appreciate it. And hopefully you all have a great weekend. Take care.